Welcome to Walking Away. This is Book Club. We're still in Chapter 3 of Renovation by Dallas Willard. We're going over question 8 today, which is, why does sensuality come to play such a major role in human ruin? The quote that stood out to me is that God abandons them to a worthless or a non-functional mind, that is, a mind that simply does not work. I think that this is a fruitful time for a discussion of hell, because there's this very strange conception in at least the American church of both heaven and of hell, but we'll stick to hell for the time being, that, well, first of all, that hell is like a created place, which has always struck me as odd, and more recently struck me as contradictory to God's character. And I know that might sound like I'm in danger of becoming a universalist, but I'm not. Because the mind apart from God being the source of, as you're fond of saying, the logos, the divine reason, and our ability to reason is derived from that, from his reasoning being made in his image, that is the province of hell, is the mind. So when we speak of being abandoned to a mind that does not work, thinking like Romans 1, where Paul talks about how though knowing the truth, they reject it in favor of a lie. And that's because their mind simply no longer works as it should, because they have exchanged the glory of God for created things, which are both unworthy of our worship as image bearers of God, but also incapable of standing underneath the weight of the worship that we have to give. The worship of a human being crushes anything other than God. They just can't stand up to it. And because of that, thank God, the unquenchable thirst to have an object worthy of worship is misplaced. The human psyche has to come up with something to fix that problem. And in so doing, it consumes itself. And that's where I think hell is. If you could, we'll use terminology of place. And I think a lot of other theologians would perhaps not put in these terms, but agree with it, that hell is more of a state of being than a place. It is simply the absence of God, which is a willful act of the human being that does not acknowledge him and his glory. Which begs a very interesting question. And that is, what would a mind apart from God and all of his gifts be like?
Yeah, I think I can engage with that a little bit in the sense of how we can elevate materiality or material things to the place of God, but also we can elevate principalities or logi, as they're sometimes called, to the and replace.
Yeah, things like scientism.
The logos, exactly. Yeah. The logos with
some lesser form.
With the logi themselves. And that I think Hebrews really gets at this a little bit, is that Hebrews use Jesus as the logos, I guess.
Right.
Logos and God.
Yeah.
Logos, God, Jesus interchangeably. But when we keep Jesus above those lower principalities, then
life works.
It keeps you in a fullness, exactly, and as you
right.
interact with,
and it glorifies those lesser forms as well. So, for instance, getting back to the question of point of sensuality, when we do, as you just discussed, of elevating material things to the place of God, sensuality is the logical conclusion of having done that, right?
Well, what's interesting too, all the glory goes to him, but he redeems those principalities, material things.
Yes, and sanctifies them.
Exactly.
Yeah, suits them to purpose, which is what he does with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. What he does with us, what he does with church, like any symbol.
All physical reality.
Sure. All reality.
And
to where even sensuality, I guess, to loop that all the way back to the question.
Even our sensuality can be redeemed and sanctified to suit his purposes, which is union with him, peace with him, which brought me sort of to some thinking I've been having about how do you define holiness? that's a very big question that the church has been trying to answer since the beginning. But I think in keeping with our theme of practicality with this book in particular, that perhaps a sufficient workable definition to proceed with the establishment of rules of life of holiness would be simply to be in that state, which, at least for humans, it's obviously like human holiness is derivative of God's holiness, and God's holiness is just a fact of his being and nature. But human holiness consists of, as simply as I can put it, being in the state of being that allows one to relate to God as one ought. And so that, for example, think of concepts like mercy. Well, working definition that I have of mercy is the division between good and evil. Well, clearly holiness requires mercy. You can't relate to God properly if there is any evil admixture within the goodness that has been imputed to you by God and by having been created in his image. And so that brings us back to the holiness, the sensuality question, and the question, the topic you brought up of sanctification is the office of Christ and his incarnation, capital I, is to begin the process by which flesh is redeemed and suited to purpose, which is antithetical to sensuality as a mechanism for soul ruin, which is, I think, achieved primarily because having deified materiality, the best we get is sexual pleasure. And because our appetites are infinite, because they were purposed for right relationship with God, the appetite for pleasure is part of that. And if our God is in our bellies and the best we can get is sexual pleasure, we will pursue that infinitely. And because it is a disorder of the affections, it is a self-destructive pursuit. And we see that in like the physical, like the medical field and the psychological field are kind of catching up to the scripture. It only took them a couple millennia, but whatever. We understand now that sex is just, in fact, the most potent drug that exists. It gives you the best high that a human being can experience. But even it, outside of its proper context, is self-defeating, because the high gets less every time you use it for that purpose. And only in its redeemed or sanctified form of covenant marriage can it give what it was intended to give without destroying its user, if you will. Because you're not using it anymore. You are participating in the design for which you were created.
Which is really why we have the church, to mitigate these relationships and to sanctify them and to bless them.
Yeah, to ensure that they are actually being prosecuted, if you will, in a way that is beneficial to both parties and to the broader community of faith as a whole. And really a broader point of any kind of learning, which is sort of the project of the church, is to learn God's character in an experiential way, in a communal way, is that the only way to do that properly is relationally, which is like it's contra to the sensual as central. I think thinking of like Martin Buber and his ideas that he expressed in I Am Thou, that in order to relate properly to a thing, you cannot attempt to focus on any of its attributes. And in the pursuit of sensuality, you are, in fact, deifying the aspect of sexual pleasure for yourself. And there's this interesting interplay of relationship to God, relationship to self, and relationship to his other creatures that is interrupted. There's a broken link in that chain when we abuse ourselves for our own pleasure. That just stops the flow, to use the metaphor of like rivers of living water that that Christ promises to be and to make in his people. You're damming the river and fouling the water.
The reverse of that is pretty interesting, though, as well, as one ascetic might abstain from appeasing the body that they, especially as, I mean, through food, abstinence will sharpen your will, like we were talking about.
Yeah,
on the
it's a practice. It's a practice.
Yeah.
Training for righteousness.
Absolutely. Kind of in a similar sense, like.
Yeah, like to abstain from sensual pleasure in any form.
Connection.
Yeah, is to consciously recalibrate the affection towards its proper end.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's always, the danger of Phariseeism. Don't strike me down. Wherein the spiritual practice of any kind can be made into a bribe for God. But the point remains that the heart, in its proper orientation, employs spiritual practices from a place of privilege. What I mean by that is it's not a thing we have to do. It's not a thing that we're doing to make God approve of us. It's a thing that it's a gift that God has given us in order to participate with him in his sanctifying purposes in our life. I think is the general posture of, I think, God's desire for us in everything we do, is that we can perceive every task as a privilege of having been made in God's image and a means by which we can relate to him.
There's also the sense in like that fasting and abstinence in and of itself is good to sharpen the will, like how we were talking about, but also should be mitigated by the church too, in the sense that it can be
taken to extremes
or perceived by yourself as a form of pride.
Yeah, just getting back to that fundamental sickness of the fallen condition of humanity.
Right.
That self-orientation that can always creep up, even in the most seasoned Christian who has devoted his or her entire life to cultivating proper relationship to God. And so that's why, I don't know the Orthodox position on this idea, but progressive revelation is a thing. Like, if we were to understand completely our propensity for pride at the beginning of our relationship with Christ, it would mortify us in a bad way. We would be consumed by despair, which I think, is it Wesley that said that, maybe it wasn't Wesley, but it was a post-Renaissance Christian thinker, not in a Calvinistic milieu, that said that despair was Satan's primary weapon against Christians.
It's one of the passions.
Yeah.
Despondency.
Right.
For sure.
So I guess as like a practical send-off, what passion has most power over you? And consider what you might do to break its hold on you. With that, I think we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Walking the Way Book Club. Please like, comment, and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content. We can't wait to see you in the next one. God bless.